Get away from that bike. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The parking lot was dark, the two men were laughing, and one of them had a tire iron already swinging in his hand. Rebecca Lawson was 28 years old, 5'4", and she hadn't slept a full night in 4 months. But she stepped forward anyway. If you've ever done something terrifying, not because you were brave, but because you simply had no other choice, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, drop the name of your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story can travel. The graveyard shift at Sam's All-Night Diner didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived the way it always did, with the jangle of keys, the smell of burnt coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 10 o'clock, and the particular quality of silence that belongs only to places where tired people go to feel slightly less alone. Rebecca Lawson pushed through the back door at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her shift officially started, because being late cost her 15 minutes of pay, and she had counted every dollar she had left in the world that afternoon. $42 and some change. She'd written it on the back of a receipt and tucked it in her apron pocket like it was a verdict. Bakersfield in October had a way of being cold without warning. 1 hour it was 60 degrees and reasonable, and the next the wind came off the valley floor and cut straight through whatever you were wearing. Rebecca was wearing a thin blue uniform that Sam had provided on her first day and had never replaced, and she was wearing it over a long-sleeve undershirt she'd bought at the dollar store 3 years ago that had a small hole near the left elbow she covered with a rubber band. She didn't think about any of that consciously anymore. It had become part of the background noise of her life, the constant low hum of not quite enough that she'd learned to function inside of. Leo was already asleep when she carried him in from the car. He was 6 years old and small for his age, with a face that in sleep looked so peaceful that Rebecca sometimes stood and watched him breathe just to confirm that he was in fact breathing. That wasn't paranoia. That was Tuesday. Leo had been diagnosed with severe asthma at 18 months, and in the 4 years since Rebecca had developed a second set of senses that operated entirely outside her conscious mind, tracking the rhythm of his chest, registering the sound of his breath, from across a room cataloging the slight wheeze that appeared when the air quality dropped, or when the temperature shifted too fast, or when he'd been running too hard at recess. She knew his lungs the way a mechanic knows an engine that keeps almost failing. Not from textbooks, from 4 years of 2 a.m. emergencies. She settled him into the last booth in the back corner, the one farthest from the door, where the light was dim and the vinyl seat was wide enough that he could curl on his side without falling. She tucked his jacket over him like a blanket and set his rescue inhaler on the table within arm's reach. Not because she expected him to need it tonight, because she always set it within arm's reach. "You good baby," she whispered. Leo didn't answer. He was deep under the way only children can sleep, completely surrendered to it, his small hand tucked under his chin. Rebecca stood there for one more second than she needed to, then she turned and went to work. The diner on a Tuesday night in late October was exactly what you'd expect. A trucker named Dale sat at the counter eating eggs and reading a paperback Western he'd clearly read before because his eyes moved too fast and he never turned back a page. 2 women in their 50s occupied booth 3, splitting a piece of pecan pie and talking in the focused, intimate way of people who have known each other a long time and don't need to fill silence. A kid 19, maybe 20, sat by the window with a cup of coffee he'd been nursing for an hour, staring at his phone with the specific hunched posture of someone who had nowhere else to be. Rebecca worked the room on autopilot. Refills, check-ins, a fresh slice of pie for the women in booth 3, who ordered a second one with the sheepish delight of people who've decided to stop apologizing for what they want. She smiled when smiling was called for, kept her voice warm, kept her movements efficient. The back of her mind never stopped running its own separate calculation. Leo's breathing the clock, the $42, the letter from their landlord that she'd read 4 times that day and understood a little better each time, even though understanding it didn't change what it said. 30 days, that was what the letter said. 30 days to come up with $800 in back rent, or the eviction process would begin. She had $42. She'd applied for an emergency rental assistance program 6 weeks ago and hadn't heard back. She'd asked her shift manager, a decent man named Phil, who genuinely liked her, if there was any possibility of an advance, and Phil had looked genuinely pained when he'd explained that Sam, The actual owner, who Phil had never once seen set foot in the diner, had a hard policy against it. She'd done the math on picking up a second job and determined that between daycare costs for Leo during those hours and the transportation costs to get there and back, she'd net about 30 cents an hour. She'd sold the 2 pieces of jewelry. She owned a small gold necklace her mother had given her, and a pair of earrings she'd bought herself the year before Leo was born, the last truly impulsive purchase of her pre-child life, and that had covered the electric bill. The $42 was what was left. She didn't tell people this. There was no one to tell, really, and even if there had been, she had learned in the years since Leo's father left quietly without confrontation one afternoon, when she came home from work and discovered that his shoes were gone from the entry and his half of the closet was empty, that there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from narrating your own suffering. It didn't help, it just made you perform it. So she carried it without narrating it, and she kept moving, and she poured coffee, and she smiled at Dale the trucker when he looked up from his Western and raised his mug. That was when she heard it. Duh. She heard the motorcycle before she saw it, before anyone in the diner saw it, because it was the kind of sound that doesn't ease into awareness. It doesn't knock. It arrives. The engine of a 1947 Harley-Davidson knucklehead, she would learn later, has a voice unlike anything manufactured in the last 50 years. It's not the high-pitched snarl of modern performance bikes or the refined growl of contemporary cruisers. It's something older and more elemental than that, a deep rhythmic thunder that seems to originate not in the machine, but in the road itself, vibrating up through the asphalt, in the foundation and the soles of your feet. Every person in Sam's all-night diner heard it. Dale looked up from his Western. The 2 women paused mid-sentence. The kid at the window pressed his face slightly closer to the glass, though he tried to do it casually. Rebecca walked to the front window. The man who climbed off the motorcycle was enormous. That was the first fact about him, the one that registered before anything else. Before the leather vest with its patches and its insignia, before the gray beard that covered most of his jaw, before the arms which were covered from wrist to shoulder in tattoos so dense they looked less like individual images and more like a second skin. He was easily 6'3" broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested not gym work, but a lifetime of physical existence. Someone who had carried heavy things and absorbed heavy things and come out the other side still standing. His hair was long and silver pulled back. He moved across the parking lot toward the diner entrance with an unhurried certainty that Rebecca recognized from a specific category of human people who have never had to announce themselves because the room changes when they walk into it. The bell above the door rang. He stood in the entrance for one beat, scanning the room with the kind of flat, thorough attention that takes in everything and commits to nothing. His eyes moved to the trucker, to the women, to the sleeping child in the back booth, to Rebecca standing behind the counter. When they landed on her, they stayed for 1 second longer than they had on anyone else. Not threatening, assessing. "Coffee," he said. His voice matched everything else about him. "Sure," Rebecca said. "Sit anywhere." He took a stool at the counter 3 down from Dale, who suddenly found his Western very interesting again. Rebecca poured the coffee. She'd poured 10,000 cups of coffee in her life, and she poured this one the same way she poured all the others, filling it clean and setting it in front of him without spilling. And she said, "You want anything to eat?" He looked at the menu board, which was handwritten on a chalkboard that Sam had installed in 1987 and updated approximately never. "What's good? The eggs are fresh. Biscuits are made here. Everything else I'd steer you toward with full knowledge of the consequences." One side of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Eggs and biscuits. How do you want them?" "However they come out best." Rebecca wrote the ticket and clipped it to the wheel and went back to her work. And the diner settled back into its own rhythms around him, and the coffee sat steaming in front of the enormous man with the silver hair who had not told her his name. She would find out later that the other people in the diner that night referred to him afterward, to their families, to their friends in the months of retelling that followed, as simply the biker. But his name was Rooster, and he had been riding for 11 hours straight and had stopped at Sam's all-night diner for no reason more profound than that the light was on and he was hungry, and the parking lot had enough room to leave the knucklehead somewhere he could see it from a stool at the counter. He sat and he drank his coffee and he watched through the front window at his bike, and Rebecca brought him his eggs 12 minutes later, and for 45 minutes, nothing happened. She was refilling his coffee for the third time when he looked at Leo. She saw him look. She was trained to track it the moment when someone noticed the child sleeping in the back booth because it always prompted one of two reactions, either a softening, a loosening around the eyes, or a flicker of irritation at the irregularity of it. A child in a diner at midnight, which occasionally led to a complaint to Phil about professionalism. She'd become very good at reading which reaction was coming. This was neither one. He looked at Leo the way you look at something that costs you something to see. Like the sight of the sleeping child pulled something up from somewhere deep in him. Something he didn't advertise and didn't discuss and had been carrying for a long time. Yours, he said. Yes. How old? 6. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on Leo. What's his name? She hesitated for just a moment because even after years of working nights and bringing Leo along and watching him sleep in back booths while she worked, some instinct in her still flinched at the question. Not because she was afraid of this man specifically, because she was afraid in a vague and permanent way of having things she couldn't afford to lose. And Leo was the thing she couldn't afford to lose. Leo, she said. Rooster turned his coffee cup in his hands. Good name. I thought so. A pause, then from him, he okay? He's breathing kind of asthma, Rebecca said. She kept her voice level the way she always kept it level when she said the word because the alternative was to let 17 different emotions into it, and that didn't help anyone. He's okay tonight. Some nights are harder. Rooster looked at the inhaler on the table next to the sleeping boy. He didn't say anything for a moment. You carry that everywhere. Everywhere, she said. He looked back at his coffee. That's a good mom. Rebecca didn't answer. She picked up a rag and wiped down the section of counter that didn't need wiping because sometimes you need to do something with your hands when someone says something that threatens to crack something open in you, and you're at work and cracking open is not an option. So, it was 12:37 in the morning when the truck pulled into the parking lot. Rebecca noticed it because she was behind the counter and the front window gave a clear view of the lot and the truck's headlights swung across the diner windows in a pattern that was wrong, too fast, too erratic, the arc of someone driving without full attention or without full sobriety. It was a dark blue pickup, older, with a cracked taillight on the driver's side. It came in too hot and stopped too hard, and the two doors opened within seconds of each other, the way doors open when people inside have already decided what they're doing. She watched them because she watched everyone who came into the lot. Not out of suspicion, out of habit, out of the same relentless, low-level vigilance that had become her default operating mode. They didn't come toward the diner. They went toward the motorcycle. She felt the specific, cold clarity of a moment when your mind processes what your body already knows. It wasn't a thought exactly, more like a recognition, the same way you recognize the sound of a car that won't start, or the look on a doctor's face right before they say something you don't want to hear. She knew before she consciously articulated it what was happening. Hey, she said. Nobody heard her. She was behind the counter and her voice was normal volume, and the man at the counter 3 stools down was reading, and the women in booth 3 were talking, and the kid at the window had his earbuds in. She looked at Rooster. He was looking at his plate. Hey, she said again louder, and this time he looked up and she nodded toward the window, and his eyes tracked to where she was nodding, and what happened in his face in that instant was not panic. It was not confusion. It was something older and colder and more controlled than either of those things. His jaw set. His eyes went flat and still. He was off the stool before Rebecca had finished saying, your bike. And then he was gone through the door, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move. What happened next happened in a span of time that Rebecca in every retelling struggled to quantify. 30 seconds, 2 minutes. Long enough for everything to change and short enough that it later felt like a dream, the kind of dream that was more real than the waking world that preceded it. She stood behind the counter for perhaps 4 seconds after Rooster went through the door. She could see through the window. She could see the 2 men, one already on the motorcycle trying to figure out the ignition, one standing lookout with something in his hand that caught the light. Wrong, too long, too thin, not a phone. She could see Rooster coming out the door and across the lot, and she could see the lookout, see him, and she could see the lookout say something to the man on the bike, and she could see from 30 feet through plate glass that the situation was about to become something that had no clean ending. She didn't plan what she did next. Planning implies deliberation, and There was none. She came around the counter, grabbed the tire irons she kept under the hinge section of the bar because Sam had installed it there after a robbery 3 years ago, and told her it was just in case. And she went through the front door of Sam's all-night diner at 12:39 in the morning into the cold October dark. Get away from that bike. The words left her mouth and she heard how small they sounded in the open air, and she kept walking anyway. Because Leo was asleep 20 feet away, and because the thing in the lookout's hand was a knife, she could see that clearly now, and because Rooster was already across the lot and the odds were narrowing by the second, and she understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with the pure animal logic of a parent in proximity to danger, that the only way this ended without someone dying in the parking lot was if the arithmetic of the situation changed. She was 130 pounds. She was holding a tire iron. She was standing between two armed men and a motorcycle worth more than her annual salary. The man on the bike looked at her. The lookout looked at her. Then they both started laughing. "Lady Wine," the lookout said, "you need to go back inside." "I need you to step away from that bike," Rebecca said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. The tire iron was in both hands. She was aware in a clear and separate part of her brain that she was terrified. She was also aware that terror and action were not in fact mutually exclusive. She had learned that with Leo in every emergency room, and every 2 a.m. call to the nurse's line, every moment when the situation was frightening and something needed to happen anyway. "You serious right now?" The lookout took a step toward her, his knife loose in his hand the way people hold knives when they're not yet using them, but want you to see they have the option. "This isn't your business. Walk away." "It became my business when you pulled in." Behind her through the glass, she was aware that people in the diner were watching. Dale had turned around on his stool. The women in booth 3 had gone silent. The kid at the window had taken out his earbuds. She did not look back to check on Leo because looking back required taking her eyes off the knife, and she was not going to do that. Rooster had stopped moving. He was 10 feet to her right, taking in the geometry of the situation, and something in his stillness told her that he had recognized what she was doing and was making a calculation of his own. "Last chance," the lookout said, and his voice had changed. The amusement had dropped out of it. He was looking at her the way men look when they've decided to stop being patient, and Rebecca felt her heart rate spike into her throat and held her ground anyway. "You want to steal a Hells Angels motorcycle," Rebecca said, "in front of witnesses with a Hells Angel standing right there." She kept her voice flat. She kept her eyes on the knife. "How do you think this ends for you?" The man on the motorcycle said something to the lookout in a low, quick voice that she couldn't hear. The lookout's eyes moved to Rooster, then back to Rebecca, then to the tire iron in her hands. Something shifted in his face. Not retreat exactly, recalculation. And in that half second of hesitation, Rooster moved. He didn't speak, he didn't warn them. He simply closed the distance with the calm, purposeful efficiency of someone who has done this before and has no need to make it theatrical. The lookout spun toward him, and the knife came up, and there was a single moment, frozen and crystalline, burned into Rebecca's memory with the particular clarity of moments that decide things where the blade was between them. Then it wasn't. Then Rooster had the lookout's wrist, and the knife was on the ground, and the lookout was making a sound Rebecca had never heard a human being make before. And the man on the motorcycle had both hands up, not because anyone had told him to, but because he had looked at Rooster's face and made a sensible decision. "Get up," Rooster said to the man on the bike. His voice was very quiet. The man got up. "Both of you," Rooster said, "turn around, walk to the road, don't run, because if you run, I'll assume you're coming back, and I won't be as patient with that as I've been with this." They walked. They didn't run. Rebecca stood in the parking lot with the tire iron in both hands, and her arms were shaking, and she didn't lower the tire iron until both men were at the road, and one of them had looked back once, and then looked away, and then kept walking, and the sound of their footsteps disappeared into the dark. Then she lowered the tire iron. Then her knees tried to stop working. She caught herself on the side of the motorcycle, his motorcycle, the knucklehead, all chrome and black paint and nearly 80 years of road, and she stood there breathing, and she heard the door of the diner open behind her and the sound of someone moving toward her across the lot. She didn't look up. "You okay?" Rooster said. "Yeah," she said, and then no, maybe give me a second. He stood next to her in the dark, not touching, not speaking, Just there the way some people can be present in a moment without filling it with themselves. And Rebecca stood with her hand on the cold chrome of his motorcycle and breathed the cold October air, and thought about Leo asleep in the back booth with his inhaler on the table, and thought about $42, and thought about how she had walked out into that parking lot not because she was unafraid, but because being afraid and staying still felt worse than being afraid and moving. You didn't have to do that, Rooster said. I know. Why did you? She looked up at him then. His face in the parking lot light was unreadable, but his eyes weren't. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen a great deal and was seeing something now that surprised him, and the surprise was not small. Because it was right, she said, and because sometimes right is the only thing you've got. He was quiet for a moment, a long moment. Yeah, he said finally. That's right. Inside the diner through the plate glass, Leo stirred in his sleep, and his chest rose and fell in the dim light of the back booth, steady and certain. And Rebecca watched him breathe and felt the shaking in her arms begin gradually to stop. The shaking didn't stop for a long time. Rebecca stood in the parking lot with her hands still resting on the chrome of the knucklehead, and the night air kept moving around her cold and indifferent, the way October in Bakersfield does, like it has no opinion about what just happened to you, like the world kept turning through the whole thing and intends to keep turning now. She was aware of the tire iron still in her left hand. She was aware that her fingers were white around it. She made herself open her hand, let the thing hang loose, and then she set it against the front tire of the motorcycle with a small clank of metal on asphalt. You're cut, Rooster said. She looked at her arm. She hadn't felt it happen. She'd understood in the abstract during the confrontation that the knife had been close, that something had touched her forearm when the lookout stepped toward her, but she hadn't processed it as injury. Now she looked, and there was a clean slice along her left forearm, maybe 3 inches long, shallow but open, and the blood had run down past her wrist and dried in a thin, dark line along the heel of her hand. Oh, she said, just that. Come inside, Rooster said. I need to check on Leo first. He's fine. Dale's watching him. She looked at him. Dale? The trucker. He moved to the back booth when you went out. He's sitting 2 feet from your kid right now, looking at him like he's made of glass. Something in Rooster's voice that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it. Man looks like he's never been so scared of a sleeping 6-year-old in his life. Despite everything. Despite the blood on her arm and the adrenaline still burning off and the 30-day eviction notice folded in the pocket of her apron, Rebecca almost laughed. It came out as something else, something shorter and less controlled, and she pressed her free hand against her mouth for a second and breathed. Okay, she said, inside. Phil had been called. She didn't know who called him. Maybe Dale, maybe one of the women from booth 3, maybe the kid at the window who had, it turned out, filmed the entire thing on his phone from inside and was now sitting with the expression of someone who has witnessed something they are not sure how to process. Phil arrived 14 minutes after the confrontation, still in the flannel shirt and sweatpants. He'd been sleeping and his hair uneven on one side, and the first thing he did when he came through the door was look at the blood on Rebecca's arm and go white. Oh, God. Rebecca. It's not deep, she said. She was sitting at the counter. Someone had given her a wad of paper towels from behind the counter, and she was holding them against the cut with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has long since learned to triage her own emergencies without ceremony. We need to call an ambulance. We do not need to call an ambulance. We need to call the police, and someone should get a first aid kit, and I need to check on my son. I told you he's fine, Rooster said. He was 3 stools down, same position as before his coffee, in front of him, watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who is tracking a situation for reasons that aren't fully visible yet. You telling me and me seeing it are 2 different things, Rebecca said, and she got up from the stool and walked to the back booth. Leo was asleep, exactly as she'd left him. The jacket still over him, the inhaler still on the table, his small face still tilted toward the vinyl seat with that expression of total surrender that only children in deep sleep can manage. Dale was indeed sitting across from him, large hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the paw with the exact expression Rooster had described. He looked up when Rebecca came over. He didn't move, Dale said. His voice was low and a little rough. Not once, whole time, slept right through it. He's a good sleeper, Rebecca said. She put her uninjured hand on Leo's back, felt the rise and fall, felt the warmth of him through the jacket, and stood there for 5 seconds with her eyes closed. Then she went back to the counter. The police came at 1:15, two officers, one older and one young enough that Rebecca kept expecting him to ask where his parents were. They took her statement, took Phil's statement, took statements from Dale and from the women in booth 3 who had not, despite every reasonable opportunity to leave, gone anywhere. The kid at the window offered his phone video, and the older officer looked at it twice and then looked at Rebecca with an expression that was equal parts impressed and concerned. "You stepped outside with the tire iron," he said. It was not entirely a question. "Yes. Ma'am, that was what was available," she said. The officer looked at her. He looked at the cut on her arm, which Phil had finally convinced her to let him bandage properly with the first aid kit from the back. He looked at Leo asleep in the booth. He wrote something in his notebook. "We'll look for them," he said. "Truck was likely stolen. Plates will help." He paused. "You got a place to go tonight somewhere other than here?" "I live 12 minutes from here." "I mean somewhere with someone else in it." She understood what he was asking. She'd been asked versions of it before in hospitals and school offices, in places where someone had registered the particular arithmetic of her life and felt compelled to ask. She had learned to receive the question without flinching. "We'll be okay," she said. The officer nodded. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he closed his notebook and shook her hand and told her the department would be in touch. Then he looked at Rooster, who had said approximately nothing throughout the entire police interaction, and something passed between them. Not hostility, not warmth, just a flat mutual recognition of two people from different worlds who have long since stopped pretending those worlds don't know about each other. "Sir," the officer said. Officer Rooster said that was the entirety of their exchange. By 2 a.m, the diner had thinned down to Rebecca, Rooster, Phil, who was trying to look busy behind the counter and failing at appearing casual, and Leo still asleep in the back booth as though none of this had any bearing on him whatsoever. Dale had left. He'd stopped at the back booth on his way out and stood there for a moment looking at Leo, and then he'd put a folded $20 bill on the table next to the inhaler very quietly and walked out without saying anything. Rebecca had seen it and hadn't called after him. She'd let it land. Some things you receive without argument. The women from booth 3 had done the same thing, which is to say they'd left cash on their table that was significantly more than their bill, and the older of the two had stopped at the counter on the way out and said, "You're a good mother," and squeezed Rebecca's hand once with both of hers and then walked out into the night. The kid with the phone had asked Rebecca twice if it was okay that he'd filmed it, and she'd said yes both times, and he'd seemed unsure whether to be relieved or guilty, and had ultimately settled on both and left. So it was the three of them and the sleeping boy and the quiet. Phil refilled Rooster's coffee without being asked. It was the kind of thing you do when you are a shift manager at a diner and you have absolutely no script for the situation you are currently in. Rebecca sat on the stool next to where she'd been sitting before. Her arm ached now, not acutely, but steadily, the way cuts ache when the adrenaline finishes burning off and the body sends its invoice for what it's been through. She held the bandaged forearm against her stomach and looked at the counter and thought about nothing for a moment, which was a luxury she almost never gave herself. "What did it cost you?" Rooster said. She looked up. The inhaler, the medication. He was watching her with those flat, still eyes that took everything in and gave nothing away. "What does a month of that run?" She was quiet for a moment. "Why, because I want to know." "That's not an answer." "No," he said, "it's not." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The inhaler is about $90 without insurance. The controller medication is $240 a month. There's a nebulizer treatment when he has an acute episode that runs about $60 session, and he needs it roughly twice a month." She hadn't meant to give him the full number. It came out because he'd asked with the particular directness of someone who wanted the real version, not the reassuring version, and she was too tired to perform reassurance right now. "So call it $400 a month just for breathing, plus the ER visits when the controller medication isn't enough, which happens about 3 times a year, and which I'm still paying off from the last one." Silence. "You do all of that on this?" He didn't gesture at the diner exactly. He didn't need to. "I do all of that on this," she said. Another silence. Longer. Outside the parking lot was empty, and the night was still, and the knucklehead sat where it had always sat, undisturbed now, chrome catching the light. "You've got somewhere to live," he said. Not a question. Checking. Rebecca looked at her apron pocket. For 30 more days, she said. And then she stopped because she hadn't meant to say that either. Rooster went very still. 30 days, he repeated. It's handled, she said. The reflex was immediate, the same one that made her say, "We'll be okay" to the police officer, the one she'd been running on for years. The determination to not be the woman in the story who needs saving, to be the woman who manages, who copes, who handles it. It's not your situation. I didn't say it for... I know why you said it, he said, and I know why you wish you hadn't. She looked at him. His expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted, or maybe something had risen closer to the surface, something that had been down deep and quiet since she'd said Leo's name, and he'd looked at the sleeping boy with those eyes that cost him something. "What's your name?" he said. "Rebecca Lawson." "Rooster," he said. He didn't offer anything beyond that. Just the name delivered straight the way you give someone the thing they need without making a production of it. "I know," she said. "I heard your friends call you that." She paused. "When you came in, I came in alone." "I know, I meant..." She stopped. She meant, "I know who you are. I know what the vest means. I know what the patches mean. I'm not pretending otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "And you still walked out there. The situation required it." He made a sound that might have been in another man, in another context, a laugh. It wasn't a laugh, but it was something. Most people who know what the vest means walk the other direction. Most people aren't trying to keep their dinership, Rebecca said. If those men stole your bike, this parking lot was going to turn into something that would have gotten Phil hurt and probably gotten me fired and definitely gotten my son woken up in the middle of a confrontation. She met his eyes. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the move that made the most sense in the moment." "That right?" "That's right." He looked at her for a long time. "Most people would have called that lie a kindness," he said. "I'm not most people." "No," he said slowly. "You're really not." And Phil came out from the back at 2:30, and his expression carried the specific combination of apology and discomfort of a man who is about to say something he'd rather not say. "Rebecca," he said, "I need to talk to you for a second." She turned on the stool. She already knew. She could see it in the way he was holding his shoulders up and tight, the body language of someone bracing. "Okay," she said. "It's about tonight." Phil glanced at Rooster and then made a conscious decision to continue anyway. "I got a call from Sam." The name landed in the room the way it always did, with the specific weight of an owner who is never present and whose absence functions as a kind of permanent judgment. "Sam," she said. "He monitors the security cameras remotely. He saw..." Phil stopped. Tried again. "He saw you leave the premises with the tire iron during your shift." Rebecca waited. "He said..." Phil looked genuinely pained. "He said you left your post and that you removed property from the diner during working hours. He's saying that's grounds for..." "Phil." "I know," Phil said. "I know, Rebecca. I told him you were protecting a customer's property and that you were injured doing it and that you..." "What did he say?" Phil's jaw tightened. He said that wasn't his liability to carry. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes when something you already knew in your bones gets confirmed out loud, and the confirmation doesn't make it hurt less, it just makes it precise. "So I'm fired," she said. "He wants you to come in on Thursday to Phil." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Am I fired?" Phil looked at the counter. "He said he'd have to let you go, yes." Rebecca nodded once. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She looked at the apron she was wearing and thought about the fact that the $20 Dale had left on the back table was the only thing she had coming to her tonight that was clean and uncomplicated and hers. She became aware very quietly that Rooster had gone completely still. "Phil," what Rooster said. Phil turned. "What's Sam's number?" Phil blinked. "I'm sorry." "The owner, Sam, what's his number?" Phil looked at Rebecca. Rebecca had no script for this and gave him nothing. I don't think I should..." "Phil," Rooster said, and his voice had not risen and had not changed in any way that was dramatic or threatening, but something in it had arrived that had not been there a moment ago, something that made Phil reach into his pocket and pull out his phone. "I'll call him," Phil said. "I'll call him right now." The call lasted 7 minutes. Rebecca listened to Phil's side of it from her stool, watching his face go through several colors, and she listened to the particular rhythm of a man who is holding a phone at a slight distance from his ear, because the volume on the other end requires it, and she understood that Sam was saying things about protocol and liability and the integrity of his establishment, and she understood that Phil was saying things about loyalty and fairness and what the security footage would look like if it got out. And she understood that at some point Phil said the words Hell's Angels to Sam, and there was a noticeable change in the cadence of Sam's responses. When Phil hung up, he set his phone on the counter very carefully, like he was setting something fragile down. "You're not fired," he said. Rebecca looked at him. "Your job is secure. Sam is—" Phil seemed to be searching for a word, reconsidering his position. "Why?" "Because I explained the situation more fully." Phil. Phil looked at the counter. "Because I put Rooster on for 30 seconds and let him explain it." Rebecca turned to Rooster. He was looking at his coffee. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Your kid needs his medication," he said. "You need your job. That was a simple math problem." "That was my job. You can't—" "I didn't fire you or hire you," he said. "I had a conversation. Your boss made a business decision." He looked up. His eyes were level. "You walked into a parking lot for my bike. I made a phone call. We're not even close to even." She didn't have an answer for that. She wanted to argue and she couldn't find the argument, not because she was wrong in principle. She still believed stubbornly in managing her own life, but because the logic of it was too clean and the exhaustion in her bones was too complete for her to fight something that had already been done. "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient, and she said them anyway. He nodded. Once. The way people nod when they've closed a door on a conversation that doesn't need more words. At 3 in the morning, Leo woke up. He didn't wake in crisis, no wheeze, no coughing, just the natural surfacing of a small boy who had been asleep for hours and whose body had decided it was time. He sat up in the back booth and blinked at the unfamiliar light configuration of a near-empty diner and said with perfect childhood logic, "Is it breakfast time?" Rebecca was across the room before she consciously decided to move. "Hey, baby, no, it's the middle of the night still. You okay?" Leo considered this. "My throat is scratchy." She picked up the inhaler. "Let me hear you breathe." He breathed. She listened. The wheeze was faint, barely there, the kind that you'd miss if you hadn't spent 4 years learning the specific sound of this specific pair of lungs. She looked at his color, his posture, the slight tension around his eyes. "2 puffs," she said, "nice and slow." He took them with the practiced ease of a child who has done this so many times it's lost its scariness. She watched his chest counted, silently watched it again. "Better," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. He looked past her toward the counter. "Who's that?" She turned. Rooster was watching from his stool with that same expression she'd caught earlier, the one that cost him something that came from somewhere old and not entirely healed. "His name's Rooster," Rebecca said. "He's a customer." Leo looked at Rooster with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old, which is to say he looked at him the way nobody over the age of 10 is still capable of looking at anyone, without armor, without pretense, with complete attention. "You have a lot of tattoos," Leo said. "I do," Rooster said. "Do they hurt?" "They did." "Did-da-dan." "Not anymore." Leo thought about this. "My shot hurts," he said, "the one in my arm, but Mom says it's going to help me breathe better." "Your mom's right," Rooster said. Leo considered him for another moment with those unguarded eyes, and then apparently reached a conclusion that satisfied him because he leaned back against Rebecca's side and said, "I'm hungry." "Of course you are," Rebecca said, and she kissed the top of his head and looked up at Phil, who was already moving toward the kitchen. She didn't look at Rooster, but she felt with the quiet certainty of someone paying attention that he was still watching Leo and that something in his face had opened further than it had all night, and that whatever the thing was that lived behind his eyes, old and heavy and not entirely healed, it was very close to the surface now. She didn't ask about it, not yet. Some doors you don't open until the person on the other side is ready. But she felt it there waiting in the particular silence between 2 people who have been through something together and are still in the room in the middle of the night with nowhere else to be. Leo ate scrambled eggs and half a biscuit at 3 in the morning, with the contentment of a child who finds nothing unusual about midnight diners and large tattooed strangers. Because children that age haven't yet learned to find things unusual, They find them interesting or they find them boring. And a man with silver hair and a leather vest who answered questions directly and without talking down to him was in Leo's assessment interesting. He ate. He asked Rooster what the eagle on his forearm meant. Rooster told him it meant you kept flying no matter what the weather did. Leo thought about that and nodded like it confirmed something he'd already suspected. He asked if the motorcycle outside was his, and Rooster said yes, and Leo asked if it was fast, and Rooster said fast enough, and Leo said fast enough for what, and Rooster said fast enough to get where you're going, which Leo accepted as a complete answer. Rebecca watched this exchange from 2 feet away with her bandaged arm in her lap and something tight in her chest that she didn't name. It was the easiness of it that got her. Leo didn't perform comfort. He either had it or he didn't. And with most strangers, he had a cautious, watchful quality that Rebecca recognized as her own, the same low-level self-protection that children absorb from their environments, the way they absorb language. But he sat across from Rooster and ate his eggs and talked about the motorcycle and the tattoos with the relaxed openness of a child who has, for reasons his 6-year-old brain couldn't articulate, decided that this particular stranger is safe. She trusted Leo's instincts. She'd learned to. They were often more accurate than her own. Phil came out of the kitchen, refilled her coffee without being asked, and set a piece of pecan pie in front of her that she hadn't ordered. "On the house," he said quietly. "Don't argue with me tonight." She didn't. It was 3:20 in the morning, and the diner was quiet, and her son was eating eggs, and the cut on her forearm ached with the steady persistence of something that was going to remind her of tonight for the next week. And she sat with her coffee and her paw and tried to remember the last time someone had given her something without requiring her to justify it first. She couldn't. Rooster left his stool at 3:45. Not to go, he moved to the back booth, the one adjacent to where Leo was sitting, and he sat with his coffee. And he said to Leo very casually, "You know what makes a knucklehead different from every other Harley they ever made?" Leo didn't know. He was immediately interested. "The engine," Rooster said. "They stopped making them in 1947, 79 years ago. The one out there, that engine has been running since before your grandmother was born." Leo's eyes went wide. "Does it still work?" "Just rode it 11 hours today." "Does it break a lot?" "Everything breaks," Rooster said. "You just have to know it well enough to fix it when it does." Leo considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Mom fixes things," he said. "She fixed the sink." "Did she?" "With a wrench. She watched a video on her phone first, but then she did it." He was proud of this fact, delivering it with the loyalty of someone who wants credit given where it's due. Rooster looked at Rebecca. She looked at her coffee. "YouTube," she said. "I'm not claiming any real expertise." "She also fixed the heater," Leo said. "In the car. The thing under the car." "The exhaust bracket," Rebecca said. That, Leo confirmed. "YouTube again?" "And a forum thread from 2009 that was surprisingly detailed," she said. Rooster's mouth did the thing it had done earlier, not quite a smile, the adjacent thing. "Woman repairs her own exhaust bracket and walks into a parking lot with a tire iron," he said, "and she's not claiming expertise." "I know what I know," Rebecca said. "I don't know what I don't know." "Most people are the opposite," he said. That landed somewhere. She let it. Same. At 4 in the morning, Leo fell asleep again. He went down the way he always went down, when he'd had a middle-of-the-night waking fast, completely like someone threw a switch. 1 minute he was finishing his biscuit, and the next his head was on his folded arms on the table, and his breathing had gone deep and even. Rebecca moved him back to the wider booth, resettled his jacket over him, put the inhaler back within reach. She did all of this without thinking, on pure physical memory, and when she turned around, Rooster was watching her with that expression again. She sat down, not at the counter this time, at the small table across from him, because Phil had gone into the back to restock, and because it was 4 in the morning, and the formalities of counter distance had worn thin, and because she was tired in a way that had gotten past her defenses. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "Say what?" "Whatever you've been working up to since I sat down." A pause. Something shifted in him, visible like a tide going out the surface of him changing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He didn't look at her or shower. "I had a son," he said. She waited. "His name was Danny. He was 4 years old." Another pause. "He had a heart defect, something they didn't catch early enough, and then found too late." He stopped, started again. His mother, we weren't together by then. She was doing it alone. Same as you. Working nights carrying the medical bills, trying to hold the whole thing together with no net underneath her. He turned the cup again. I wasn't there the way I should have been. I had my life and my road and my reasons, and none of them look as solid now as they did then. Rebecca didn't move. He died in the spring, Rooster said. 1987. He was 4 years and 2 months old. He said it with the flat precision of someone who has carried a fact so long it has worn smooth, all the raw edges gone, just the hard, clean shape of it remaining. And I have thought about his mother almost every spring since then. What she was carrying, what I wasn't carrying with her. The diner was silent and around them. Phil was in the back. Leo was breathing softly in the booth behind her. I'm sorry, Rebecca said. The words were not enough, but they were the honest ones. I'm not telling you for sorry, he said. I'm telling you because when you said Leo's name and I looked at him sleeping, and then you told me about the inhaler and the medication and the 30 days, he stopped, picked it back up. I know that arithmetic. I know what it costs to run that equation every single day and still show up for the shift and still smile at the customers and still set the inhaler on the table and tell yourself it's handled. Rebecca's throat was tight. She didn't answer. It's not handled, he said, not cruelly, as a statement of fact delivered the way a doctor delivers one because the truth spoken plainly is sometimes the only useful thing. She looked at the table. No, she said quietly, it's not. That admission cost her something. She could feel what it cost. She had not said those 3 words, it's not handled, to another human being in 4 years. Not to Phil, not to the caseworker at the assistance program, not to the landlord she'd called twice trying to negotiate the back rent. She had managed and coped and handled, and she had not said it's not handled because saying it felt like a door she couldn't close again once it was open. But it was 4 a.m. and her arm ached, and her son was breathing in the booth behind her, and the man across from her had just handed her the most private thing he owned, a dead child's name, a spring in 1987, the specific shape of a regret he'd carried for nearly 40 years, and she couldn't give him the managed version in return. It would have been an insult. What do you need, he said. She looked up. Right now, not eventually, not when things get better. What do you need, Amon? She opened her mouth to say, I'm fine. She closed it. Leo needs a specialist, she said. There's a pediatric pulmonologist in Los Angeles who has a specific protocol for severe pediatric asthma. His current doctor in Bakersfield is good, but he's a general practitioner, and Leo has already hit the ceiling of what a general practitioner can do for him. The specialist costs, she stopped. I've looked at the numbers. It's not possible right now. Rooster was quiet for a moment. What else? The medication costs are going to go up. His controller medication, they're reformulating it. The generic is going away. The brand name is... She pressed her lips together. I've been trying not to think about it. And the housing. The housing is a 30-day problem on top of the rest of it. She said it steadily. So that's where we are. He nodded once slowly like he was taking inventory. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. Clearly. I want to be clear about that. I said it because you asked me directly and you deserved a direct answer. I know, he said. You're not asking. You are never asking. You'd rather fix the exhaust bracket by yourself with a YouTube video than ask someone to hand you a wrench. She almost said something sharp. Stopped. Because he was right and they both knew it, and sharpness would have been deflection, and she was too tired for deflection. Yes, she said, that's accurate. Stubborn's not a character flaw, he said. I know stubborn. I've run on stubborn my whole life. He turned his coffee cup one more time and then set it down with a quiet finality. But there's a version of stubborn that becomes a wall between you and the help that was always yours to take. And you've been on the wrong side of that wall for a long time. Rebecca looked at him across the small table in the near-empty diner at 4 a.m. and felt something shift in her chest, not breaking exactly, more like the release of something that had been held too tightly for too long, the specific ache of a muscle finally allowed to unclench. She didn't cry. She was a woman who had trained herself out of public crying through years of necessary practice, and she didn't do it now. But her eyes went bright and she breathed through it, and she looked at the table for a second before she looked back at him. I don't know how to do this differently, she said. I've been doing it this way for 6 years. I don't know what the other version looks like. The other version, Rooster said, looks like you let someone else carry part of it for a while. He left at 4:30. He stood up from the table, put $200 in cash on the counter next to his coffee cup. Not on the table, not in her hand, just there where it couldn't be refused without making it a confrontation. And he picked up his jacket. That's for the arm, he said. Medical copay, whatever it runs you. Rooster, Rebecca. He said her name for the first time since she'd told it to him, and something in the directness of it stopped her. Let me do something simple. Take the $200. She looked at the counter. She looked at him. Okay, she said. He nodded. He walked to the door and then he stopped with his hand on the push bar and he turned back. There's a man named Carver, he said. He calls himself a sergeant-at-arms, but what he actually is someone who makes sure the people in our orbit don't get left behind when they shouldn't be. I'm going to talk to him. Rebecca went still. About me. About what's right. He looked at her steadily. You walked into that parking lot for my bike. I'm not going to go home and pretend that didn't happen. That's not how I operate. I walked into that parking lot for my job and my son, she said. I've told you that. And I heard you both times, he said. Doesn't change what you did or what I owe. He pushed the door. The bell rang. Get some sleep when your shift ends. And check the arm if the bleeding's through the bandage by morning. Get to urgent care. Don't decide you're fine when you're not. The door swung shut behind him. Rebecca stood at the counter and listened to the knuckleheads start that deep rolling thunder that she'd heard for the first time just 4 hours ago. And that already sounded different to her than it had then, the way sounds change when you attach a person to them. She listened to it move through the parking lot and onto the road and fade west toward whatever Rooster was heading toward. And then it was gone, and it was quiet, and the first faint gray of early morning was beginning at the edges of the windows. Phil came out of the back. He looked at the counter, at the $200, at Rebecca standing with her bandaged arm against her side and her eyes on the door. You okay, he said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Phil nodded. He picked up the coffee pot. He refilled her mug. He went back to the back without saying anything else because Phil was a man who had learned across decades of running graveyard shifts exactly when words helped and when the best thing was to simply keep the coffee coming. Rebecca sat down. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She looked at the $200 on the counter and thought about a man named Danny who had been 4 years and 2 months old in the spring of 1987, and about a woman named Unknown, face unknown, who had carried his medication and his appointments and his future alone, and who had not had anyone set $200 on a counter and say, let me do something simple. She thought about that woman. She thought about what Rooster had said about being on the wrong side of a wall. In the back booth, Leo stirred. She heard the small shift of his breathing. Not alarm, not distress, just the natural movement of sleep, and she listened with her second set of senses until it settled again into the deep rhythm of rest. She sat with her coffee in the gray morning coming at the windows and the $200 and the man named Carver who made sure people didn't get left behind, and she tried to understand what it might feel like to let someone else carry part of the weight, to stop performing fine when the true answer was not fine, to be for once on the side of the wall where help was possible. She didn't have it figured out yet, but for the first time in 4 years, she was sitting still long enough to try on her own. The call came at 7:15, 40 minutes before the end of her shift. She was behind the counter when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, and the number was unknown, a 559 area code Fresno and the surrounding valley, which meant nothing specific to her. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered it. Rebecca Lawson. The voice was male, older, with a measured cadence that made her think of someone accustomed to delivering information efficiently. Yes, my name is Carver. I ride with Rooster. She gripped the counter. He called me an hour ago, Carver said. He told me about last night. He told me about your boy. A pause. He told me about the 30 days. She looked at the window. The parking lot was ordinary in the morning light. A few cars, a delivery truck, the empty space where the knucklehead had been. I don't know what he told you exactly, she said carefully. He told me the truth, Carver said, which is what he does. I want to set up a meeting. Not today you're working and your boy needs rest. Thursday if that works. There's a place called Ray's on Chester Avenue. You know it. I know it. Noon, bring Leo if you need to. Nobody's going to make that uncomfortable. Another pause. We're not asking you for anything, Ms. Lawson. I want to make sure that's clear before you decide. This is a conversation. You come, you listen, you say no. We shake hands and you walk away with nothing owed. That's a promise. Rebecca's hand was tight on the phone. What kind of conversation? The kind where we talk about what's right, Carver said. Same as Rooster does. She breathed. In, out. Thursday, she said. Noon, Ray's on Chester. We'll be there, he said. And then Miss Lawson, what you did last night, most people don't do that. Rooster wanted me to tell you that it mattered. Not just the bike, what it said about you. He wanted you to know he sees it. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. Tell him thank you, she said. Tell him yourself, Thursday, Carver said. And there was something warm in it, something almost like a smile. Get some rest. He hung up. Rebecca stood behind the counter with her phone in her hand and the morning light coming through the windows and Leo asleep in the back booth in the bandage on her arm, and $200 she hadn't asked for, and a meeting on Thursday she hadn't expected, and she felt the thing in her chest again, the unclench, the shift, the door that she'd thought she couldn't close again once it opened. She had been wrong about the door. It wasn't a door you couldn't close. It was a door you didn't need to close. It was a door you walked through. She put her phone back in her apron. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to work. She didn't sleep well the 2 nights before Thursday. That wasn't new. Rebecca hadn't slept well in years. Not the deep, unbroken kind of sleep that leaves you feeling restored, because deep, unbroken sleep requires a certain confidence that nothing will go wrong in the dark, and she had not had that confidence since Leo was born. But the Tuesday and Wednesday nights after the diner incident had a different quality to them. It wasn't Leo's breathing keeping her up. It was the meeting. It was Carver's voice on the phone saying, we're not asking you for anything, and the way she'd wanted to believe it, and the part of her that had spent 6 years learning not to believe things too easily, running its own separate counter-argument on a loop. She knew what the Hells Angels were. She wasn't naive, and she wasn't from somewhere sheltered enough to have missed the general shape of what that name meant in the world. She'd grown up in Bakersfield, which was not a small town and not an innocent one, and she had served enough people in enough diners at enough late hours to have developed a working understanding of the difference between the version of things that appeared in newspaper headlines and the version that sat on a stool at your counter and ate eggs and talked to your son about a 1947 motorcycle engine. Those two versions were not always the same, but she was going to a meeting on Thursday with a man named Carver, and she was going to bring Leo because she had no one to leave him with, and she was going to sit in a diner on Chester Avenue and listen to what was right, and the part of her that had learned to protect itself and her son was going to be present and paying attention every second. She told Leo they were meeting someone for lunch. The motorcycle man, he said immediately. Maybe, she said, and some other people. Leo considered this with the gravity of a child evaluating social plans. Will there be motorcycles? Probably not inside the restaurant. He accepted this compromise. Ray's on Chester was a diner not unlike Sam's, a long counter booths along the wall. The smell of coffee that had been there since before anyone currently working had started their shift. Rebecca arrived at 11:55 because arriving early was a habit so deep in her it operated below the level of choice, and she stood in the entrance for a moment and scanned the room. Carver was already there. She knew it was him before he stood up, the same way she'd known certain things about Rooster before he'd told them to her, not from the vest or the patches which he was wearing, but from the way he held the room. He was in his early 60s with a wide, weathered face and the kind of calm that comes not from ease, but from a long time spent making peace with difficult things. He was shorter than Rooster by several inches and broader through the chest with close-cropped gray hair and hands that looked like they had been useful for decades and intended to remain so. He stood when he saw her and he said, Ms. Lawson, and his voice was exactly as she'd heard it on the phone, measured direct warm without being performative about it. Carver, she said, thank you for coming. He looked at Leo. He smiled, a real one, no production to it, the smile of a man who has been around enough children to know that the only approach that works is a genuine one. And you must be Leo. I know about knucklehead engines, Leo said by way of introduction. Carver's smile got wider. Is that right? We're going to get along fine. Yeah. There were 3 other men at the booth. Carver introduced them Tank, who was enormous, and said almost nothing but listened with the full body attention of someone for whom listening was a practiced skill. A man called Bishop, who was lean and 50-ish, with reading glasses tucked in his vest pocket and an expression of patient intelligence. And a younger man named Dex, who had the alert, watchful quality of someone who had recently been given responsibility and was taking it seriously. Rebecca sat across from Carver. Leo sat next to her and asked for chocolate milk, which Carver flagged down without hesitation, and Leo received it with the straightforward gratitude of a child who asks for things without apology. And Rebecca felt the familiar small pull of wishing she still knew how to do that. "Rooster sends his apologies," Carver said. "He had to be in Fresno today. He'll be in touch directly." "He doesn't owe me anything," Rebecca said. "He doesn't see it that way," Carver said. "But we'll come back to that." He folded his hands on the table. "I want to tell you something about who we are, because I think you came here with a picture in your head, and I'd rather work with the actual thing than whatever that picture is." She held his gaze. "Okay. We're not a charity," he said. "We're not a nonprofit. We're not a social services program, and we don't have a board of directors, and nobody's going to send you a tax form at the end of the year." He said it plainly without apology. "What we are is a community, and communities have rules, and the first rule of ours is that we don't leave people behind who stood up when it counted." He paused. "You stood up. Tuesday night in that parking lot, you stood between those men and Rooster's bike with a tire iron in your hands, and you held the line long enough for him to get there. You did that for your reasons, and we respect your reasons. But it happened, and we're not going to pretend it didn't." Rebecca looked at the table. "I keep telling him I didn't do it for him." "I know," Carver said. "He told me. He also told me that the reason doesn't change the fact." He leaned forward slightly. "You want to know the difference between a man who deserves what he's got and a man who just got lucky. The man who deserves it recognizes when someone else did something real, and he responds to it. Rooster recognizes it. So do we." She looked up. "What are you proposing?" Bishop opened a folder on the table. Not dramatically, he set it down the way you'd set down a document you'd prepared carefully because the situation deserved care, not because you wanted to impress anyone with the gesture. "Leo's medical situation," Bishop said. His voice was quiet and precise. "Rooster gave us the specifics you shared with him. The controller medication, the specialist in Los Angeles, the cost structure." He looked up. "We have a relationship with a benefits coordinator at a healthcare organization in the Valley. We use her for our own members. With your consent, we'd like to get Leo enrolled in a comprehensive pediatric coverage plan. No cost to you, full coverage specialist, visits, medications, emergency care, the nebulizer treatments, everything." Rebecca's chest went tight. She had heard things like this before. Not from people like this, but from programs, from applications, from caseworkers who used similar language before explaining the waiting list was 18 months long, or the income threshold is slightly below what she made, or the documentation required was something she didn't have. "What's the catch?" she said. "No catch," Bishop said. "There's always a catch." "Ms. Lawson," Carver's voice even impatient, "I understand why you're asking that. You've been in systems long enough to know that when something sounds clean, it usually isn't. But this isn't a system. This is us deciding to do something and doing it. The paperwork is real, the coverage is real, and the only thing we need from you is your signature in Leo's medical records, so the coordinator can set it up correctly." She looked at Leo. He was drawing something on a napkin with a crayon the waitress had produced from somewhere, his chocolate milk half gone, entirely unconcerned with the adult conversation happening above his head. "How long?" she said. "The coverage. How long does it run?" Bishop looked at Carver. Something passed between them, on hesitation, more like a confirmation that they'd already agreed on the answer. "Until Leo turns 18, Bishop said. 12 years. The number hit her like a physical thing. 12 years. Leo was 6. 12 years meant through elementary school and middle school and high school, through every winter season when the cold air tightened his lungs, through every reformulation of every medication, through every specialist visit, an emergency room night, and 2 a.m. calculation of what she could and couldn't afford. 12 years meant the arithmetic she'd been running every single day since he was 18 months old, and the doctor had said the word asthma for the first time that arithmetic stopped. It didn't get easier. It stopped. She pressed her lips together. She breathed. Okay, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Okay, tell me what you need me to sign. That was the first thing. The housing was the second. Carver set down his coffee and said, there's a two-bedroom townhouse on the north side. We own the building through a property LLC. It's been sitting empty for 3 months because we've been waiting for the right tenant. He looked at her steadily. 2 years no rent. After 2 years, if you want to stay, you pay market rate and we treat you like any other tenant. If you want to go somewhere else by then, you go with no obligation. Rebecca stared at him. Why, she said. Because 2 years is enough time, Carver said. Enough time to get Leo stable with the specialist, enough time for you to get out from under the back rent, enough time to stop running on empty and start running on something with actual fuel in it. He paused. 2 years from now, you're not the woman who has $42 and a 30-day notice. You're the woman who has 2 years of breathing room behind her and a kid who's been seeing the right doctors and a bank account that's been allowed to grow instead of being bled dry every month. The specificity of it undid her slightly. The $42. Rooster had told him about the $42, and she hadn't known until this moment that he'd absorbed that detail and passed it to Carver with the accuracy of a man who understood that the small numbers were the true numbers, that the $42 was the whole story in miniature. He told you about the $42, she said. He told me everything you told him, Carver said, because he wanted me to understand the real situation. Not the version that's easier to hear. She looked away, at the window, at the ordinary morning outside. I have a job, she said. I can pay rent. In 2 years you can, Carver said. Right now you can't. Not and also pay back the $800 you owe and also cover the medication gap and also eat. He wasn't cruel about it. He was the way Rooster had been direct without brutality, the delivery of truth by someone who respected her enough not to soften it into something manageable. Let us do the simple thing. 2 years. Then you stand on your own ground. Leo looked up from his napkin drawing. He had drawn what appeared to be a motorcycle with wings. He held it up for Carver's inspection. Carver looked at it with full seriousness. What is that, a flying motorcycle? Leo said. Does it work? In my drawing, it does. That, Carver said, is the correct answer. He looked back at Rebecca with something in his eyes that was both gentle and firm. What do you say, Ms. Lawson? She thought about the door again, the one she'd been on the wrong side of. She thought about the woman who had carried Danny through a spring in 1987 and had not had anyone set money on a counter and say, let me do something simple. She thought about 6 years of exhaust brackets and YouTube videos and $42 and perform fine when the true answer was something else entirely. She thought about Leo's lungs. Yes, she said. Okay, yes. So, the paperwork took 40 minutes. Bishop had brought everything, the enrollment forms for the healthcare plan, the lease agreement for the townhouse with its 2 years of zero rent, a contact sheet for the benefits coordinator named Maria, who would handle Leo's medical transition directly. Rebecca read everything. She read it slowly and carefully, the way you read things when you have learned that the fine print is where the catch lives, and there was no catch. And she read it again to make sure, and there was still no catch. Leo finished his chocolate milk and his drawing and fell into conversation with Tank, who had said approximately nothing to the adults for the entire meeting, but who answered Leo's questions about motorcycles and road trips and why grown men had pictures drawn on their arms, with the patient, thorough engagement of someone who had perhaps been waiting for a conversation worth having. Dex leaned across the table while Rebecca was signing the last form and said quietly, for what it's worth, what you did Tuesday night, I've been writing with these guys 4 years. I've seen people do a lot of different things when things go sideways. He paused. I haven't seen that. She looked at him. He was maybe 30 with honest eyes and the slight self-consciousness of a young man trying to say something real without making it awkward. I was terrified, she said. Yeah, he said. That's what made it something. She capped the pen. She set it down on the last signed form, and she looked at the stack of documents and felt the specific unreality of moments where your life changes on paper, where the distance between what was and what is fits inside a signature and a date. She thought about the eviction letter folded in her apron pocket at work, the one she'd read 4 times, the one that had said 30 days in the flat language of legal process, indifferent to everything it was doing to the person reading it. I need to do one thing, she said to Carver. What's that? I need to call my landlord, myself. I need to handle the back rent. I need to pay that. She looked at him steadily. I know you said, we set aside funds to clear the back rent, Carver said. I know. I'm saying I want to make the call myself. I want to be the one who resolves it. She paused. I need to close that door myself. Does that make sense? Carver looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. It makes complete sense, he said. And there was something in his face that might have been respect, the clean kind, the kind that isn't given to weakness or performance, but to the specific dignity of a person who, even when they're accepting help, insists on their own agency within it. The funds will be in your account by end of business today, he said. What you do with them is yours. She called the landlord from the parking lot of Ray's while Leo sat on a low concrete wall and added wings to things in his drawing. The landlord's name was Mr. Tully. He was not a bad man. He was a man with a mortgage on the property and a policy about back rent and a liability he'd explained to her twice, and in the language of someone who was sorry, but whose sorry had limits. She had spoken to him 3 times in the past month, and each call had ended in the same place, the 30 days, the $800, the process that would begin when neither of those things changed. She called him now. Mr. Tully, she said when he answered. It's Rebecca Lawson, Unit 12. A brief pause. Ms. Lawson, I'm calling to let you know that the $800 in back rent will be transferred to you by end of business today. Full amount. I'd like to request a written confirmation that the account is current once you receive it. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him recalibrating. Yes, that's fine. If the transfer clears today, I'll send confirmation by email. Thank you, she said. Ms. Lawson. His voice had shifted slightly, something in it that was almost but not quite an apology. I want you to know I know, she said. You were doing what the situation required. So was I. She paused. We'll talk about the forward rent when I've had a chance to look at my new situation. I'll be in touch before the end of the month. She hung up. Leo was looking at her from the concrete wall. Are we going home? He said. Not yet, she said. She sat down next to him on the wall and looked at his drawing, the motorcycle with wings, and now a small figure on it, stick-limbed and grinning with what appeared to be a cape. Who's that? She said. That's the rider, Leo said. He goes everywhere. Where does he go? Leo thought about it with real consideration. Wherever someone needs him, he said with the complete confidence of a 6-year-old who finds this entirely obvious. Rebecca looked at the drawing. She looked at her son. She thought about a man who had ridden 11 hours and stopped because the light was on, and about what Carver had said about communities and their rules, and about the wall she'd been on the wrong side of, and about the door she had walked through. Yeah, she said softly. That sounds right. She put her arm around Leo's shoulders and he leaned into her with the easy, unthinking trust of a child who has never doubted that his mother is there and the afternoon was warm for October. And somewhere across the city, a benefits coordinator named Maria was pulling up a file. And in a property LLC office, a lease was being processed for a 2-bedroom townhouse on the north side, and $800 was moving through a system toward a landlord who would send a confirmation email and close a 30-day clock that had been running over her like a tide. She sat on the wall with her son and felt the weight she'd been carrying redistribute, not disappear, not dissolve, but shift the way a load shifts. When someone puts their shoulder under part of it and you discover that your own back is still there, still strong, still capable, just no longer required to carry all of it alone. It was a strange feeling. It was the strangest feeling she had felt in years. She thought she might get used to it. The townhouse was on Oleander Street, 9 minutes from Sam's, by the route Rebecca drove 11, by the route she usually drove because the shorter way had a stretch of road that flooded when it rained, and she'd learned not to trust it in October. She pulled up in front of it on Friday morning with Leo in the passenger seat and the key that Carver had handed her the day before in the same plain, unhurried way he did everything. And she sat in the parked car for a long moment before she got out. Leo had no such hesitation. He was out of the car and at the front door before she'd unbuckled her seatbelt, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet with the anticipatory energy of a child who has been told there is a backyard and intends to investigate it immediately. Mom, come on. Give me a second. You always say, give me a second, and then it's more than a second. Leo, It's true. She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the front of the building, 2 floors, a small covered porch, a window on the upper floor that caught the morning light and held it. It was not large. It was not anything that would appear in a magazine or prompt someone to use the word charming in a real estate listing. It was a solid, ordinary, well-maintained townhouse on a quiet street, and it had 2 bedrooms, which meant Leo got his own room for the first time in his life, and it had a backyard, and the heat worked, and the water pressure was good, and it did not have a landlord named Mr. Tully and a 30-day clock running in the background. She put the key in the lock. The door opened. Leo went through it like a small, joyful force of nature, his footsteps loud on the hardwood floor, already calling out room to room with the pure excitement of a child taking inventory of a space that is going to be his. She heard him find the kitchen and declare it big. She heard him find the downstairs bathroom and flush the toilet once experimentally, apparently satisfied with the result. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the sound of 2 doors opening and closing, and then his voice from above higher with delight. Mom, I can see the backyard from up here. There's a tree. Is there? She called up. A big one. Can I climb it? When I've had a chance to look at it? That means yes later. He translated accurately, and she heard him move to the window and press closer to it, and she stood in the empty downstairs with the morning light coming through the front window and her hands at her sides, and nothing in the space around her that wasn't hers. She had rented 4 places in her adult life. She had moved into all of them with the background awareness that the space belonged to someone else, that she was a temporary occupant of someone else's decision, and that the rules of it, what you could hang on the walls, what you could change, what you had to leave exactly as you found it, were not hers to make. She had lived inside that awareness so long, she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's always there. Standing in the empty townhouse on Oleander Street, she noticed its absence. She breathed. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum briefly, the way you press on something that aches, not to make it stop, but to acknowledge it, and then she exhaled and walked to the stairs. Let's see this tree, she said. Rooster called on Saturday. She was in the middle of moving boxes. She didn't have many because she had learned in the years of managing with not enough that the discipline of owning less was both a practical necessity and eventually a kind of freedom. And her phone was on the kitchen counter, and she almost missed the call because she had a box in both hands and her back was to the counter. She set the box down and picked up the phone, and the number was the same unknown 559 that had turned out to be Carver. But when she answered, it was Rooster's voice, lower and rougher, with the slight road noise quality of someone calling from somewhere that had wind in it. You get into the house, okay, he said. We're in, she said. Leo has claimed the room with the tree view. Good room, Rooster said, and she could hear that he knew the house, that he had been there, that the tree view was a detail he recognized. It landed without strangeness. It landed as what it was, a man who had thought carefully about a specific small human and had chosen the house accordingly. Thank you, she said, for the house, for Carver, for all of it. Carver does what's right, Rooster said. I just pointed him. You know what I mean. A pause. Yeah, he said. I know what you mean. She leaned against the kitchen counter. Outside, she could hear Leo in the backyard talking to the tree, the way 6-year-olds talk to trees, not quite to it, not quite to himself, but in that middle register of a child working something out through the process of narrating it aloud. How's his breathing? Rooster said. Good today. Maria from the healthcare coordinator called this morning. Leo's first appointment with the pulmonologist in Los Angeles is 2 weeks from Tuesday. Dr. Reeves, Rooster said. She stopped. You know her. I made some calls, he said. Flat direct, no embellishment. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Rooster, she's the best in the state for pediatric cases like his, he said. She has a protocol, a specific combination approach for severe persistent asthma in children under 10. She's had results with kids who weren't responding to standard treatment. He paused. I wanted to make sure it was her specifically, not just the nearest specialist. Rebecca stood in her new kitchen with the phone against her ear and the sound of her son talking to a tree coming through the window, and the specific sensation of being looked after in a way she had no practiced response for because it had not happened to her in long enough that she'd stopped holding space for the possibility. How did you know about her? She said. Her voice was quieter than she intended, a pause longer than the others. I did a lot of research, he said after Danny, years after, when there was nothing else I could do for him, but I couldn't stop needing to do something. He stopped. I learned everything I could about the condition, about what the right treatment looked like, about who was doing the best work. Another pause. It didn't change what happened, but it was something I could do, so I did it. She understood then what he hadn't said directly, that the research he'd done in the grief years after 1987 was sitting in him still intact, available. And that when she told him about Leo's lungs in the diner at 4 in the morning, he had reached for it immediately. The way you reach for a tool you've kept sharp for decades on the chance that someday it would be needed. You've been carrying that a long time, she said softly. Carrying's not the right word anymore, he said. It's more like it became part of the equipment. Something you have because the road requires it. He cleared his throat. Dr. Reeves, the appointment's confirmed. Carver's coordinator sent it to you this morning. She checked her email. It was there. Tuesday the 14th, 9:30 AMA Pediatric Pulmonology Practice in Los Angeles. With a 4.8 rating and 112 reviews and Dr. Reeves's name at the top. Okay, she said, she breathed. Okay. You need anything else before then, you call me directly, he said. Not Carver, me. I won't need Rebecca. Her name in his voice direct and certain. I know you won't need to. Call anyway. She paused. Okay, she said again. Tell Leo the tree in that yard is a valley oak, he said. It's about 60 years old. It was there before the house was. She looked at the window, at the backyard, at the shape of her son moving around the base of the tree, his hands in his pockets, his face tilted up toward the branches. I'll tell him, she said. The call she didn't expect came on Monday. It was Phil, and his voice had a quality she recognized from the night of the incident, that particular combination of discomfort and purpose of a man who is about to say something he's prepared himself to say. I gave my notice this morning, he said. She straightened. Phil, I've been thinking about it for 2 years, he said. Sam's operation, the way he runs it, the way he treats people. You know, I've never liked it. I've stayed because of the staff, because of you specifically. But after Tuesday night, after the way he called you and tried to use protocol to cover what was basically just protecting his liability. He stopped. I'm done. I gave him 30 days. Phil, your income. I'll be fine, he said. I have savings and a brother-in-law with a restaurant in Visalia who's been asking me to manage it for 3 years. He paused. I should have said yes 2 years ago. She sat down on a box. You're really leaving. I am. A beat. But that's not the main thing I'm calling about. His voice shifted, the discomfort falling away, something cleaner underneath it. Sam is selling, she blinked, selling the diner. He called me this morning before I even gave my notice. He's been approached by a buyer and he's taking the offer. He wants to close the sale within 90 days. Phil paused. The thing is, the buyer is offering to retain existing staff at current rates, and the new operator wants to keep it running as a 24-hour diner. Your position is safe, but I thought you should know before it became official. She turned it over in her mind. New owner, new operator, Phil gone. Do you know who the buyer is? She said. That's the other thing, Phil said slowly. The sale is going through an LLC. I don't have the full name, but the contact on the purchase agreement. He stopped. Then it's Carver. The word landed in the empty kitchen and sat there. Carver, she said. His name is on the document. I don't know what entity he's buying it through, but it's him. Phil's voice had the careful neutrality of someone relaying information without editorializing, because the editorial would have been too large to contain. I thought you'd want to know. She held the phone against her ear for a long moment after Phil said goodbye. She looked at the kitchen wall. She thought about Sam, who had never once set foot in the diner he owned, calling from somewhere remote to tell Phil that a woman who'd been injured defending a customer's property had left her post and removed property from the premises. She thought about Sam making a business decision when Rooster got on the phone for 30 seconds. She thought about Sam now taking an offer on the diner through a process that had Carver's name on the purchase agreement. She thought about what Carver had said at Ray's Communities. Have rules, and the first rule is that we don't leave people behind who stood up when it counted. She hadn't fully understood the scope of that statement on Thursday. She was beginning to understand it now. She called Rooster. He picked up on the second ring. The diner, she said. A pause. What about it? Carver's buying it. Another pause. Not the pause of someone surprised, the pause of someone deciding how much to confirm. Phil told you, Rooster said. Phil told me. Yeah, he said. Rooster. She kept her voice level. I need to understand what's happening. What's happening, he said, is that Sam ran a diner badly for 30 years and treated his staff badly for 30 years, and when the chance came to move him out of the equation, Carver moved him out. He paused. It's a legitimate business transaction. The price is fair. Sam called his broker last week. It was already in motion. And Carver just happened to be the buyer. Carver happened to want a diner, Rooster said, and she could hear that adjacent to a smile quality in his voice again. He's been talking about it for years. Bad coffee in Bakersfield has been a personal grievance of his since 2019. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Not to stop from crying, to stop from laughing, because the laugh that wanted to come out of her was too large and too unwieldy for the kitchen she was sitting in, too full of the strange specific relief of discovering that the world had, without her knowledge, been quietly rearranging itself into something livable. The staff keeps their jobs, she said. Staff keeps their jobs, Rooster confirmed. Better management, better hours policy, actual functional HR so that nobody can call from wherever Sam calls from and tell a woman who just got cut protecting his property that she left her post. His voice had an edge on the last part. Not anger exactly, but the flat certainty of someone who has identified an injustice and corrected it with the tools available. She sat with it for a moment. All of it, the house, the medical coverage, the specialist, the diner changing hands, the 30-day clock that had been dismantled piece by piece over 5 days, the $42 she'd counted on the back of a receipt on Tuesday afternoon that felt now like something from a different life. Why, she said, not confrontationally, genuinely. All of this, why? He was quiet for a beat. Because Danny never got a Dr. Reeves, he said. Because his mother never got a 2-year lease, and someone to clear the back rent, and a community that put its shoulder under the weight. He stopped. Continued. Because I was on the road when I should have been there, and I can't go back and fix that, and I've known that for 39 years. But I'm here now, and you're here now, and Leo is here now, and the situation was fixable. His voice was even and certain. When a situation is fixable, you fix it. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. She had no answer for that. She didn't try to find one. He wants to meet you, Rooster said. Carver does. Not for business, just to have dinner. Him and his wife, you and Leo somewhere, that doesn't have paper napkins. He said to tell you his wife makes the best enchiladas in the Central Valley, and she will be offended if you decline. She almost said, I'll be fine. She almost said, I don't want to impose. She caught both reflexes before they left her mouth, recognized them for what they were, and let them go. Tell him yes, she said. Good, Rooster said. There was warmth in it. Real warmth, the kind that doesn't perform itself. I'll be in Bakersfield Friday. I'd like to see how Leo's doing before the appointment. He'll want to talk about the tree, the Valley Oak. I told him how old it was. He wants to know if it has a name. Old trees should have names, Rooster said. We'll think of one. So on. Friday arrived the way good things arrive when you've stopped bracing for them quietly without announcement, without the quality of impending difficulty that Rebecca had learned to read in the texture of her days. She was in the backyard with Leo when she heard the knucklehead on the street, that deep rolling thunder that she recognized now, the way you recognize a voice distinct from everything else that moves through the world. Leo heard it too. His head came up. His eyes went wide. Is that go around front, she said. Don't run into the street. He was already moving. She followed him through the side gate and onto the sidewalk, and Rooster was parking the knucklehead in front of the house, and Leo stood on the sidewalk, watching with the full-body intensity of a child in the presence of something magnificent. And when Rooster swung off the bike and Leo said, "It sounds different on our street," Rooster looked at him and said, "Everything sounds different on the street where it belongs." Leo considered this. Does the motorcycle belong here? Today it does, Rooster said. That was enough for Leo. He asked immediately if he could sit on the bike, and Rooster looked at Rebecca, and she nodded. And Rooster lifted Leo onto the seat with the matter-of-fact ease of a large man handling a small child. And Leo sat there with his hands on the handlebars and his feet nowhere near the footrests, and his face arranged in an expression of absolute total satisfaction. Rebecca stood on the sidewalk and watched, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing all week. The unclench, the shift, the gradual release of something that had been held too long. She let it happen. She stopped managing it. "He looks right on it," Rooster said, standing next to her. "Don't get ideas," she said. "He's 6. He's 6 now." He made the sound that wasn't a laugh. "Fair." They stood on the sidewalk in the October sun and watched Leo be 6 years old on a 1947 Harley-Davidson knucklehead, and the street was quiet around them. And the valley oak in the backyard was 60 years old and waiting for a name. And in 2 weeks there was an appointment in Los Angeles with a doctor who had the right answers, and the back rent was paid, and the diner would open Monday under new management, and the 30-day letter was folded in a kitchen drawer. Now, not because she'd saved it as a trophy, but because she decided it was evidence, the kind you keep to remind yourself of the distance you've traveled. "The tree," Leo called from the motorcycle. "Did you think of a name?" Rooster looked at Rebecca. She looked at him. "We were thinking," Rooster said to Leo, "that it should be something strong." "And old," Leo added. "Strong and old," Rooster agreed. "What do you think about Sergeant?" Leo turned this over with genuine deliberation. "Sergeant," he repeated, tasting it. "Like in the army. Like someone who's been standing their ground for 60 years, Rooster said. "Still there, still standing." Leo looked at the sky above the roofline where the upper branches of the oak were visible. He looked back at Rooster. Then he nodded with the gravity of someone ratifying an important decision. "Sergeant," he said. "That's his name." And Rooster looked at Rebecca, and something passed between them. Not words, not the need for them, just the simple grounded recognition of two people who had come through something real and were standing on the other side of it in the Bois on a quiet street, in front of a house with a name tree in the yard, and a bot with good lungs sitting on an 80-year-old motorcycle that still ran because someone had loved it carefully and kept it going and refused across all the years and miles to let it stop. Sunday morning, 5 days after the townhouse on Oleander Street became home, Rebecca Lawson woke up at 7 without an alarm, which she had not done in 6 years, and she lay still for a moment and listened for Leo's breathing, the way she always did, the way she would always do, because that was not a habit she would unlearn, and she did not need to. It was hers, it was love in its most practical and unglamorous form. It was the thing that had gotten them here. She listened. His breathing was clear, deep and easy and untroubled, the breathing of a child who had been seen and cared for and given space to simply be, which was what he had always deserved and what he had now. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where Sergeant the Valley Oak was holding his 60 years of ground in the early morning light, patient, and certain the way things are, patient and certain when they have deep enough roots. Her phone was on the counter. She had 3 unread messages, one from Maria confirming the appointment, one from Carver's wife, whose name was Gloria, and who had already sent 2 recipes in anticipation of the dinner she was planning, with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who expresses love through feeding people, and one from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, when she opened it, to be from Dex, the young one from Thursday, the one with the honest eyes who had sent a single line. Videos at 340,000 views and climbing. People keep saying the same thing in the comments. They say that's a real one. She looked at the message for a moment. The video, the kid at the window. The one with the earbuds, the phone pressed slightly toward the glass. She had known it existed. She had said yes when he asked if it was okay. She had not thought much about where it would go. 340,000 people had watched a woman in a thin uniform walk into a dark parking lot with a tire iron in both hands, terrified and moving anyway because being afraid and staying still had felt worse than being afraid and moving. She set the phone down. She poured her coffee. She looked at Sergeant through the window, and she thought about what 340,000 people saw when they watched that video, and she thought about what she saw, and she decided they were probably looking at the same thing, which was not a hero and not a symbol, but just a person in the middle of the night who did what the moment required and didn't stop to calculate whether she was the kind of person who did things like that. She was. She always had been. She just hadn't had a tree in the yard before. The coffee was hot, and the morning was quiet, and Leo was sleeping in the room with the good view, and somewhere across Bakersfield, a 1947 knucklehead was parked in the lot of whatever place Rooster had spent the night, and it would be on the road again today, the way it had been on the road every day for nearly 80 years. Because some things keep running when they are loved, right? And given the road they were made for. Rebecca Lawson had been loved right. It had taken longer than it should have and cost more than it should have, and arrived through a parking lot at midnight, and a tire iron, and a sleeping boy, and a man who had carried a dead child's name for 39 years, and had finally found a place to put some of the weight. But it had arrived, and she and Leo were standing in it, and the tree had a name, and the road ahead was clear.